Before Australia's six colonies federated in 1901, they were to an almost ludicrous degree separate. Each issued its own postage stamp, set clocks on its own time, had its own system of taxes and levies. As Geoffrey Blainey notes in the Shorter History of Australia, a pub owner in Wodonga in Victoria who wished to sell beer brewed in Albury on the opposite bank of the Mirror River in New South Wales paid as much duty as he did on beer shipped from Europe. Clearly this was madness. So in 1891 the six colonies, plus New Zealand, which nearly joined but later dropped out, met in Sydney to discuss forming a proper nation, to be known as the Commonwealth of Australia. It took some years to iron everything out, but on the 1st January 1901 a new nation was declared. Because Sydney and Melbourne were so closely matched in terms of preeminence, it was agreed in a spirit of compromise to build a new capital somewhere in the bush. Melbourne, meanwhile, would serve as an interim capital. Years were consumed with squabbles about where the capital should be sited before the selectors eventually settled on an obscure farming community on the edge of the Tibbenhilla Hills in southern New South Wales. It was called Canberra, though the name by then was often anglicised to Canberry. Cold in the winter, blazing hot in the summer, miles from anywhere, it was an unlikely choice of location for a national capital. About 900 square miles of surrounding territory, most of it pastoral and pretty nearly useless, was ceded by New South Wales to form the Australian Capital Territory, a federal zone on the model of America's District of Columbia. So the young nation had a capital. The next challenge was what to call it, and yet more periods of passion and rancor were consumed with settling the matter. King O'Malley, the American-born politician who was a driving force behind federation, wanted to call the new capital Shakespeare. Other suggested names were Mayola, the first syllables of the state capitals, Opossum, Gladstone, Thirstywell, Kookaburra, Cromwell, and the originally named Victoria Defender or Defender. In the end, Canberra won more or less by default. At an official ceremony to mark the decision, the wife of the Governor-General stood up before a gathering of dignitaries and, in a querulous voice, announced that the winning name was the one that had been in use all along. Unfortunately, no one had thought to brief her, and she mispronounced it, placing the accent emphatically on the middle syllable rather than lightly on the first. Never mind. The young nation had a site for a capital and a name for a capital, and it had taken them just 11 years since union to get there. At this blistering place, all being well, they might get a city going within half a century or so. In fact, it would take rather longer. Although Canberra is now one of the largest cities in the nation and one of the most important planned communities on Earth, it remains Australia's greatest obscurity. As national capital go, it is still not an easy place to get to. It lies 40 miles off the main road from Sydney to Melbourne, the Hume Highway, and is similarly spurned by the principal railway lines. Its main road to the south doesn't go anywhere much, and the city has no approach at all from the west other than on a dirt track from the little town of Tumut. In 1996, the Prime Minister, John Howard, caused a stir after his election by declining to live in Canberra. He would, he announced, continue to reside in Sydney and commute to Canberra as duties required. As you can imagine, this caused an uproar among Canberra citizens, presumably because they hadn't thought of it themselves. What made this particularly interesting is that John Howard is by far the dullest man in Australia. Imagine very committed funeral home director, someone whose burning ambitions from the age of 11 was to be a funeral home director, whose proudest achievement in adulthood was to be elected president of the Queanbeyan and District Funeral Home Directors Association. Then half his personality and half it again, and you have pretty well got John Howard. When a man as outstandingly colorless as John Howard turns his nose up to a place, you know it must be worth a look. I couldn't wait to see it. You approach Canberra along a dual carriageway through rural woodland, which gradually morphs into a slightly more urban boulevard through still and woodland, until finally you arrive at a zone of well-spaced but significant-looking buildings and you realize that you are there, or as near there as you can get in a place as scattered and vague as Canberra. It's a very strange city, in that it's not really a city at all, but rather an extremely large park with a city hidden in it. It's all lawns and trees and hedges and a big ornamental lake, all very agreeable, just a little unexpected. I took a room into the Hotel Rex for no other reasons than that I happened upon it and had never stayed in a hotel named for a family pet. The Hotel Rex was exactly what you would expect a large hotel built of concrete and called the Rex to be. But I didn't care. I was eager to stretch my legs and gamble about it in all that green space. So I checked in, dumped my bags, and returned at once to the open air. I'd passed a visitor's center on the way in, and recollected it as being a short walk away, so I decided to start there. In the event, it was a long way, a very long way, as things in Canberra invariably proved to be. The visitor's center was almost ready to close when I got there, and in any case was just an outlet for leaflets and brochures for tourist attractions and places to stay. In a side room was a small cinema showing one of those desperately unbeat promotional films with a title like Canberra It's Got It All. The one that boasts how you can water ski and shop for an evening gown and have a pizza all in the same day because this place has got it all. You know the kind I mean. But I watched the film happily because the room was air-conditioned and it was a pleasure to sit after walking so far. It was just as well that I didn't require an evening gown or a pizza or water skiing when I returned to the street because I couldn't find a thing anywhere. My one tip for you, if you ever go to Canberra, is don't leave your hotel without good map, a compass, several days' provisions, and a mobile phone with the number of a rescue service. I worked for 2 hours through green, pleasant, endlessly identical neighborhoods, never entirely confident that I wasn't just going round in a large circle. From time to time I would come to a leaf roundabout with roads radiating off in various directions, each presenting an identical vista of antipodean suburban heaven, and I would venture down the one that looked most likely to take me to civilization, only to emerge 10 minutes later to another identical roundabout. I never saw another soul on foot or anyone watering a lawn or anything like that. Very occasionally a car would glide past, pausing at each intersection, the driver looking round with a despairing expression that said, "Now, where the fuck is my house?" I had it in mind that I would find a handsome pub of the type that I had so often enjoyed in Sydney, a place filled with office workers winding down at the end of a long day. So popular at this hour that there would be an hour's spell of happy people on the pavement. This would be followed by dinner in a neighborhood bistro of charm and hearty portions. But their versions of these or any other type seem signally lacking in the sleepy streets in Canberra. Eventually and abruptly, I turned the corner and was in a central business district. Here at last were stores with restaurants and all the other commercial amenities of a city, but all were closed. Downtown Canberra was primarily a series of plazas wandering between retail premises, and devoid of any sign of life but for a noise of slap and clatter that I recognized after a moment as the sound of skateboards. Having nothing better to do, I followed the sounds to an open square where half a dozen adolescents, all in backward-facing baseball caps and baggy shorts, were honing their modest and misguided skills on a metal railing. I sat for a minute on a bench and with morbid interest watched them risking compound fractures and severe testicular trauma for the fleeting satisfaction of sliding along a banister for a distance of from 0 inches to a couple of feet before being launched by gravity and the possibility of maintaining balance into space and the direction of an expanse of unyielding pavement. It seemed a remarkably foolish enterprise. If there is anything more half-witted than asking 6 adolescents in backward-facing baseball caps for a dining recommendation, then it doesn't occur to me just at the moment. But I am afraid this is what I did now. "Are you an American?" asked one of the kids in a tone of surprise that I wouldn't necessarily have expected to encounter in a world capital. I allowed that I was. "There is a McDonald's just around the corner." Gently explained that it was not exactly a condition of citizenship that I eat the food of my nation. "I was thinking of maybe a nice Thai restaurant," I suggested. They looked at me with that flummoxed, dead-end expression that you have to be 14 years old to produce with conviction. "Oh, perhaps an Indian," I offered happily and got the same non-one-home look. "Indonesian," I went on, "Vietnamese, Lebanese, Greek, Mexican, West Indian, Malaysian." As the list grew, they shifted uncomfortably, as if fearing that I was going to hold them individually accountable for the inadequacies of the local culinary scene. "Italian," I said. "There is a Pizza Hut on Lonsdale Street," piped up one with a look of triumph. "They do an all-you-can-eat buffet on Tuesday." "Thanks," I said, realizing this was getting me nowhere, and started to leave, but then turned back. "It's Friday today," I pointed out. "Yeah," the kid agreed, nodding solemnly. "They don't do it on Fridays." I found my way back to the Rex, but got only as far as the front entrance when I realized that I did not want to dine in my own hotel. It is such a tame and lonely thing to do, an ambition that one has no life. As it happened, I had no life, but that wasn't quite the point. Do you know what is the most melancholy part of dining alone in your hotel? It's when they come and take away all the other place sittings and wine glasses, as if to say, obviously no one will be joining you tonight, so we'll just whip away all these things and sit you here facing a pillar, and in a minute we'll bring you a very large basket with just one roll in it. Enjoy." So I lingered by the entrance of the Rex for the merest moment, then returned to the street. I was on a boulevard built on an important scale, though it had almost no traffic and was mostly lined with darkened office buildings lurking in dense growth. Several hundred yards further on I came to a hotel not unlike the Rex. It contained an Italian restaurant with its own entrance, which was probably as good as I was going to get. I went in and was taken aback to realize that it was full of locals, dressed up as if for an occasion. Something in their familiar manner with the waiters and with the surroundings generally bespoke a more than transient relationship with the place. When locals eat in the restaurant of a big glass and concrete hotel, you know that the community must be in some measure wanting. The waiter took away all the other place settings, but he brought me 6 breadsticks, enough to share if I made a friend. It was quite a jolly place, with everyone around me getting comprehensively refreshed. The Australians do like a drink, bless them, and the food was outstanding, but it was none the less evident that we were dining in a hotel. Canberra has quite a lot of this, as I was to discover, eating and drinking in large, characterless hotels and other neutral spaces, so that you spend much of the time feeling as if you are on some kind of long layover at an extremely spacious international airport. Afterwards, loaded with pasta, 3 bottles of Italian lager, and all 6 of the breadsticks, I never did make a friend. I went for another exploratory amble, this time in a slightly contrary directions. Certain that somewhere in Canberra there must be a normal pub and possibly convivial restaurant for the following evening. But I passed nothing and once again found myself eventually on the threshold of the Rex. I looked at my watch. It was only 9:30 in the evening. I wandered into the cocktail lounge, where I ordered a beer and took a seat in a deep-backed chair. The lounge was empty but for a table with 3 men and a lady at it, getting boisterously merry, and a lone gent hunched over a tumbler at the bar. I drank my beer and pulled out a small notebook and pen and placed them in front of the table in front of me in case I was taken with a sudden important observation, then followed that with a book I had bought at a second-hand bookshop in Sydney. Called Inside Australia and published in 1972, it was by the American journalist Jerome Gunter, a name that once towered in the annals of travel journalism but is now, I fear, largely forgotten. It was his last book. It just about had to be as he died while repairing it, poor man. I opened it to the chapter on Canberra, curious to see what he had to say about the place back then. The Canberra he describes is a small city of 130,000 people with the pastoral feeling of a country town. An easy-going place with few traffic lines, little nightlife, a modest sprinkling of cocktail lounges, and about half a dozen good restaurants. In a word, it appeared actually to have gone backwards since 1972. I was proud to see that the Rex Hotel was singled out as a stylish address for visitors. Always nice to see one's choices validated even when they are nearly 30 years out of date. And that his cocktail bar was adjudged one of the liveliest in the city. I looked up from my book and shrank at the thought that very possibly it still was. At length I turned to the chapter on Australian politics, my reason for buying the book in the first place. Apart from the scoring of Australian rules football and the appeal of a much esteemed dish called by the pie floater, think of something unappetizing and brown floating on top of something appetizing and green and pretty well have it. There is nothing in Australian life more complicated and bewildering to be outsider than its politics. I had tried once or twice to wade through books on Australian politics written by Australians, but all these had started from the novel premise that the subject is interesting, a bold position, to be sure, but not a very helpful one. So I was hoping that the detached observation of a fellow American might be more instructive. Prator gave the game start, I must say. But it was a challenge beyond even his talents for lucid compression. Here, for instance, is just a snippet of his attempt to explain Australia's system of preference voting. If after the second preference votes are added to the first, there is still no candidate with a majority of the total ballots cast. The process is repeated. The ballots of the candidates trailing at this stage of the computation are divided up on the basis of a second preference. If he inherited some second preference votes from his first man eliminated, these are now redistributed on the basis of third preference, and so on. I particularly like that casual concluding, and so on. It's a deft piece of work because it seems to say, I understand all this perfectly, but I see no need to tax you with the details. Whereas, of course, what he is really saying is, I haven't the faintest idea what any of this means, and frankly I don't give 2 tiny mouse droppings because, as I pen these words, I am sitting in the lounge bar of a bush mausoleum called the Rex Hotel, and it's a Friday night, and I am half cut and bored out of my mind, and now I'm going to go and get another drink. The uncanny thing was I knew the feeling exactly. I glanced at my watch, appalled to realize it was only 10 minutes after 10, and ordered another beer. Then picked up the notebook and pen, and after a minute's thought wrote, "Canberra, awfully boring place. Beer cold, though." Then I thought for a bit more and wrote, "Buy socks." Then I put the notebook down, but not away, and tried without much success to eavesdrop on the conversation among the lively foursome across the room. Then I decided to come up with a new slogan for Canberra. First I wrote, "Canberra, there is nothing to it." And then, "Canberra, why wait for death?" Then I thought some more and wrote, "Canberra, gateway to everywhere else," which I believe I like best of all. Then I ordered another beer and drew a little cartoon. It showed two spawning salmon, halfway up a series of lively cascades, resting exhausted in a pool of calm water, when one turns to the other and says, "Why don't we just stop here and have a wank?" This amused me very much, and I put the page in my pocket against the day I learned to draw objects that people can actually recognize. Then I eavesdropped on the people some more, nodding and smiling appreciatively when they appeared to make a quick in the hope that they would see me and invite me over, but they didn't. Then I had another beer. I think the last beer have been a mistake, because I don't remember much of that other than a sensation of supreme goodwill towards any who passed through the room, including a Filipino lady who came in with a hoover and asked me to lift my legs so I could clean under my chair. My notes for the evening show only two other entries, both in a slightly unsteady hand. One say, "Victoria bitter, why cold?" Not bitter at all, but quite nice. The other said, "I tell you, Barry, he was farting sparks." I believe this was in reference to a colorful earthy turn of phrase I overheard from the people on the next table rather than to any actual manifestation of flatulence of an intellectual nature. In the morning I woke to find the Canberra puddled under a dull, persistent rain. My plan was to stroll across the main bridge over Lake Burleigh, Griffin, to a district of museum and government buildings on the other side. It was a rotten morning, a foolish day to be out on foot, made more wretched by the slow dawning realization once I had set off from the hotel that I was embarked on an expedition even more big than one the afternoon before. Canberra is the most amazing spacious city on paper. It looks quite inviting, with its serpentine lake, with leafy avenues, and 10,000 acres of parks. For purpose of comparison, Hyde Park in London is 340 acres. But at ground level it is simply a great deal of far-flung greenness broken at distant intervals by buildings and monuments. It is worth considering how it go this way in 1911 with the capital site chosen. The competition was held for design for it, which was Walter Burley Griffin of Oak Park, Illinois, a disciple of Frank Lloyd Wright. The eldest son's design was perfectly workable, but it had a kind of brutal grandeur about it, a sort of proto-Third Reichish quality that unsettled the Australian judges. Griffin's plan, by contrast, was instantly engaging. It envisaged a garden city of 75,000 people, with tree-lined avenues angling through it and an ornamental lake at its heart. Handsome and confident, majestic but not imperious. It ideally suited the Montesquieuian for respectability without fuss that marked the Australian character. Moreover, Griffin had an advanced understanding of the importance of presentation. His submissions were not modest sketches that looked as if they had been scribbled on the back of a cocktail napkin, but a series of large panoramic tableaux, exquisitely drafted on the finest stretched linen. In this he was assisted inestimably, totally in fact, by his new bride, Marion Mahoney Griffin, who was without doubt one of the great architectural artists of this century. The drawings, all done by Marion, show a silhouetted skyline full of calm shapes. A dome here is ziggurat there, but with surprisingly little in the way of committing details. There are tantalizing impressions, ethereal, cunningly distant. There are drawings you could gaze at for hours with pleasure, but turn you back to for a moment and you cannot remember a thing that was in them, other than a vague sense of pleasing composition. Although Griffin and his wife had never been to Australia, the drawings show an almost uncanny affinity for the landscape and appreciation of its simple, unclimbing beauty and big skies that you would swear was based on their closest acquaintanceships. But Marion was a genius of the outfit. The Griffins had a decidedly bohemian bent. He liked big, full, floppy hats and velvety ties. She had an unfortunate fondness for dancing through woodlands glades in a diaphanous gowns in the mayonnaise Isidore Duncan, and this no doubt counted against them in the rough and ready world of Australian politics in the second decade of the century. In any case, they found little in the way of funding or enthusiasm awaiting them when they arrived in Australia in 1913, and the outbreak of the First World War on the following year made both scarce still. Once on site, Griffin seemed unable to get to grips with things. He had no experience of managing a big project and clearly did not suit his temperament. By 1920, no work at all had been done beyond a cursory staking out of the main roads. At the end of the year, more or less by mutual agreement, he left the project. Griffin stayed in Australia another 15 years and became one of the country's most illustrious architects, but nearly all the buildings he designed either were never built or have since been turned down. Increasingly beset by financial difficulties, he moved to India in 1935. There, in 1937, he contracted peritonitis after falling from some scaffolding and died at age 60. He was buried in an unmarked grave. Today, almost all the remains from a long and busy career in Human College at the University of Melbourne, a couple of municipal incinerators in Canberra, and Canberra is really his at all. Only the floor plan, so to speak, is his, the avenues, the roundabouts, the lake that cuts the city in half. The component parts fell to scores of other hands, none working together. An entirely new city was built on his layout, but it has none of the coherence that his design implied. It's really just a scattering of government buildings in a man-made wilderness. Even the lake, which winds a serpentine way between the commercial and parliamentary halves of the city, has a curiously dull, artificial feel. On a sloping promontory on its wooden north shore was a modestly sized building called the National Capital Exhibition, and I had called it first. More in the hope of drying off a little from many expectations, extending education significantly. It was quite busy. At the front entrance, two friendly ladies were seated at a table, handing out free visitors' packs. Big, bright yellow plastic bags, and these were accepted with expressions of gratitude and rapture by everyone who passed. "Care for visitors' packs, sir?" called one of the ladies to me. "Oh, yes, please," I said, more thrilled than I wished to admit. The visitor's pack was a weighty offering, but on inspection it proved to contain nothing but a mass of brochures, the complete works, it appeared, of the visitor center I had visited the day before. The bag was so heavy that it stretched the handles until it was touching the floor. I dragged it around for a while, and then thought to abandon it behind the pot plant. And here is the thing, there wasn't room behind the pot plant for another yellow bag. There must have been 90 of them back there. I looked around and noticed that almost no one in the room still had a plastic bag. I leaned mine against the wall beside the plant, and as I straightened up I saw that a man was advancing towards me. "Is this where the bags go?" he asked gravely. "Yes, it is," I replied with equal gravity. In my momentary capacity as Director of Internal Operations, I watched him lean the bag carefully against the wall. Then we stood for a moment together and regarded it judiciously, pleased to have contributed to the important work of moving hundreds of yellow bags from the floor here to a mustering station in the next room. As we stood, two more people came along. "Place them just there," we suggested, almost in unison, and indicated where we were sandbagging the wall. Then we exchanged satisfied nods and moved off into the museum. The National Capital exhibition was excellent. These things in Australia generally are. It wasn't a large building, but it gave a good grounding in the history and development of Canberra. What surprised me was how very recent most of it is. Several of the walls had blown up photographs of Canberra as it was in times past, and most of these were arresting when compared with the present. Lake Burley Griffin, for instance, wasn't filled until 1964. Before that, for many years it was just a muddy depression between the two halves of the city. On another wall, a pair of matched aerial photographs showed Canberra in 1959, 39,000, and Canberra now, 330,000. Apart from the addition of a few large buildings in what is known as the parliamentary zone and the filling of the lake, what was remarkable was how little changed the city looked. Thus briefed, I was eager now to see it all with my own eyes, so I left the building and ventured along the wood-like lakeside to the Commonwealth Avenue Bridge and set off for the distant and, as it were, official side of the city. The rain had stopped, but Lake Burley Griffin contains an engineering wonder, the wonder being why they bothered, called the Captain Cook Memorial Jet. A plume of water that shoots a couple of hundred feet into the air in a dazzling and unarresting manner, then catches the prevailing breeze and drifts in a fine but wretched spray over the bridge and whatever is on it. Sinning, I pushed through it and emerged on the other side into an area of most extravagantly spacious lawns, punctuated at distant intervals with governmental buildings and museums, each as remote as object view through the wrong end of a telescope. Even the National Capital Authority, the government body for the city, admits in a promotional fact sheet that many people believe the parliamentary zone has an empty and unfinished character, where the vast distance between the institutions and other facilities discourage pedestrian movement and activity. I'll say it was like walking around the city of a very large world sphere and had never quite got off the ground. I called across to the National Library because I wanted to see the Endeavour journal, Captain Cook's famous diary of his voyage. Cook naturally took the journey home his epic trip of discovery, but it was lost soon after his death and remained lost for almost 150 years before it turned up unexpectedly at a Salisbury auction in London 1953. The Australian government hurriedly bought it for £2,000, and it is now treated with a sort of reverence. we in America reserve for ancient treasures like the Constitution and Nancy Reagan. Unfortunately, as I discovered when I presented myself at the information desk, it isn't out of display, but rather is shown just once a week by appointment. I stared at the man in dismay. "But I've traveled 8,000 miles," I blurted. "I'm sorry," he said, seemed to mean it. I said a night in the Rex, I said, thinking surely that would clinch it. But he was powerless to help. He did, however, direct me to a leaflet in which I could see a picture of the journal and encouraged me to have a look around the public galleries. As it happened, these were splendid. One room held paintings showing Australians of note to other Australians. In another was an exhibition of the original drawings for the Sydney Opera House. These included not only Hudson's winning sketches, but the second and third places entries, both radiantly undistinguished. Second place went to a fat cylinder with a Hollywood style pattern in stainless steel. Third place looked like a large supermarket, and the glass case was a wooden model made by Hudson, showing that the sails of the opera house roof were not meant to echo the sailboats in the harbor, and a session that made over in books and articles inside Australia and out, but as simple sections of a sphere. Then I was across another 1,000 acres of undeveloped wells to the National Gallery and a surprisingly big museum and a fortress-like building. It was airy and various and generally very good. I was particularly taken with the outback paintings of Arthur Streeton, of whom I had not heard, and with a large collection of Aboriginal paintings, mostly done on curled dark bark on other natural surfaces and covered in colorful dots and squiggles. It is a fact little noted that the Aborigines had the oldest continuously maintained culture on Earth, and their art goes back to the very roots of it. Imagine if there were some people in France who could take you to the caves and explain in detail the significance of their paintings, why this bison is bolting from the herd, what these three wavy lines mean, because it is fresh and sensible to them as if they were done yesterday. Well, Aborigines can do that. It's an unparalleled human achievement, scarcely appreciated, and I think that is worth mentioning here. Don't you agree? I had intended to go on to Parliament House, but I emerged from the National Gallery to find that the afternoon was almost gone. I would have to leave that for next day. I started back down the gentle slope towards the lake and bridge. The skies were clearing at last, and on the far hills lay patches of silver light. Now that the clouds had ceased their low-level assault and retired to fair heights, the view was really quite fine. Canberra is a city of memorials, most of them fairly grand and nearly all with a private avenue of trees, and from here I could take it there in with a single panning motion of my head. It reminded me less of a city, much less, than of, say, a preserved battlefield. There was that sense of spaciousness and respectful greenness that you would expect to find at Gettysburg or Waterloo. It was impossible to believe that 330,000 people were tucked in that view, and it was this thought, startling, that hit me, that made me change my perception of Canberra completely. I had been scorning it for what was in fact its most admirable achievement. It was a place that had, without which of evident stress, multiplied by a factor often since the late 1950s, and yet was still a park. I imagine some sweet little American community such as Aspen, Colorado, trying to absorb 300,000 additional residents in 40 years and thought of the miles of random, carelessly dribbled infrastructure that would require the shopping malls and parking lots, the 8-lane roads stretching off into a forest of bright signs and elevated hoardings that was guarded arcs of housing, the distant plazas of supermarkets and bookstores, the tangled ganglia of motels, petrol stations, and fast food places. Well, there is virtually none of this in Canberra. What an accomplishment that is. My feeling was for the place was transformed entirely. Still, I must say a decent pub or two wouldn't go amiss. Now here is why you will never understand Australian politics. In 1972, after 23 years of rule by the Conservative Liberal Party, Australia elected a Labour government under the leadership of the dashing and urban Garth Whitman. At once Whitman government embarked on a program of ambitious reforms. It gave Aborigines rights they had not previously enjoyed, began to disengage Australian troops from Vietnam, made university education free, and much more. The government gradually lost its majority and by 1975 Parliament was in a deadlock from which neither Whitlam nor the leader of the opposition, Michael Fraser, would budge. Into this impasse stepped the Governor-General Sir John Kerr, the Queen's official representative in Australia, using a reserved private privilege not before invoked. He dissolved Whitlam's government, placed Fraser in control, and ordered a general election. The country was thrown into a fury of resentment. Before they had had any real chance to sort out their differences themselves, and an elected representative of a government on the other side of the planet had taken the matter out of their hands. It was humiliating reminder that Australia was still a true colony, constitutionally subordinate to the United Kingdom. Nonetheless, as required, the Australians held a general election at which the voters overwhelmingly turned Whitlam out of office and brought in Fraser. In other words, the electorate calmly endorsed the action that had so exercised the nation only a month before. And that, as I say, is why you will never understand Australian politics. Part of the problem, of course, is that it is nearly impossible to track Australian politics from abroad because so little news of the country's affairs leaks out into the wider world. But even when you are there and dutifully trying to follow it, you find yourself mired and in the density of argument, a complexity of fine points, as kind of tangled relationships and enmities that thwarts all understanding. Give Australians an issue and they will argue it so passionately in such detail from so many angles, with the introduction of so many loosely connected side issues, that it soon becomes impenetrable to the outsider. At the time of my visit, the big national issue was whether Australia was to become a republic, whether it was going to snip its last colonial ties to Britain and take the steps necessary to ensure that no future John Kerr ever similarly humbled the nation again. It seemed to me no issue. Surely any nation would want to have control of its own destiny. You would expect, at the very least, that the decision would be a straightforward one. Yet for 2 years, to my certain knowledge, Australians had been tying themselves in knots over every possible objection to such a change. Who will be the new president under such a system, and how can we guarantee that he never does anything he shouldn't do? What becomes of all those names like Royal Australian Air Force and Royal Flying Doctor Service, if we are not actually royal any longer? What words shall we put in the new preamble to the Constitution? Shall we refer to the Australian quality of mateship as John Hubbard would like, or shall we recognize that this is a fundamentally vacuous and embarrassing concept? Oh dear, this is awfully complicated. Maybe it would be better if we just left things as they are and hope the British are good to us. I don't mean to suggest that these are not important issues, of course, but it is an exhausting process to witness, and you do rather come away with two interlinked impressions that Australians love to argue for argument's sake, and that basically they would rather just leave everything as it is. In the end, of course, they voted against a republic, though at the time of my visit that seemed an extremely unlikely outcome. Yet another reason why outsiders will never understand Australian politics. On the other hand, and what makes us up for a lot is that Australians have the best and most entertaining parliamentary debates anywhere. American and even British television news coverage would be vastly enlivened if it provided a nightly report from Australia's parliamentary chambers. You wouldn't have to explain what it was all about, and generally surpasses understanding anyway, but just allow the audience to savor the rich trust of Australian insult. In his book Among the Barbarians, the Australian writer Paul Sheehan records an exchange in Parliament between a man named Wilson Tucker and then Prime Minister Paul Keating, of which the following is a small part. Tucker: "You're an idiot, you're just a hopeless nun." Keating: "Shut up. Sit down and shut up, you pig." "Why do you not shut up, you clown?" This man has a criminal intellect. This clown continues to interject in perpetuity. This was actually a fairly tame exchange for the linguistically versatile Mr. Keating. Among the epithets that have taken flight from his tongue during the course of public debate, and are to be found gracing the pages of whatever is the Australian equivalent of Hansard, have been scumbags, pieces of criminal garbage, sleazebags, stupid foul-mouthed grubs, peasants, mangy maggots, perfumed gigolos, gutless spiffs, box-head, immoral cheats, and stunt mouths. And that's what was just to describe his mother. I'm joking, of course. Not all parliamentary invective is quite so ripe, but is nearly all pretty good. I had watched this sort of things with the greatest of pleasure during my various Australian visits. So you can imagine the eagerness with which I parked my car in the visitors' area on Parliament Hill the next morning and proceeded across the manicured lawns for a quick look round before moving into the Adelaide. Parliament House is a new building which replaced an older, more modest Parliament House in 1988. It is a rather arrestingly horrible edifice, crowned with a ridiculous erection that looks like nothing so much as a very big Christmas tree stand. On the way in, I stepped beside a large ornamental pool to have a look at the rooftop erection. Largest aluminium structure in the southern hemisphere, declared with evident pride a man with a camera around his neck who saw me studying it. "And are there many other aluminium structures competing for the honor?" I asked before I could stop myself. The man looked flustered. "Why, I don't know," he said. "But if there are, they are smaller." I hadn't meant to offend. "Well, it's certainly very striking," I offered. "Yes," he agreed. "I think that's the word for it, striking." "How much aluminium is in it?" I asked. "Oh, I've no idea, but a great deal. You can be sure of that." "Enough to wrap a lot of sandwiches," I suggested brightly. He looked at me as if I were dangerously stupid. "I don't know about that," he said, and after a moment's befuddled hesitation, took his leave. As it was a Sunday morning, I had to expect the Parliament House to be open to visitors, but it was. I had to submit to a security inspection and had a small pocket knife taken away from me, and 20 minutes later was sawing away on a scone in the cafeteria with something far more lethal. The whole of Parliament House is rather like that, superficially grave and security conscious, in keeping with the trappings of an important nation, but at the same time really quite relaxed, as if they know that no international terrorists are going to come storming over the parapets and that visitors are mostly just people like you and me who want to see where it all happens and then have a nice cup of tea and a cautiously flavorful treat in the cafeteria afterwards. Inside it was much handsomer than the bland exterior had suggested, with a lot of native woods covering the floors and walls. Best of all, you weren't headed around in a group but left to explore on your own. I have never been in America's Capitol building, but I dare say they don't just leave you to wander as whimsy takes you. I felt here as if I could go anywhere. That if I had known which was the right door, I could have slipped into the Prime Minister's office and scribbled a note on his blotter, or perhaps left my salmon cartoon to brighten his day. A couple of times I furtively tried door handles. They were always locked, but no alarms went off, and no security people crossed through the windows to smarter with me nets and take me away for interrogation. In the areas where security people were posted, they were always friendly and happy to answer any questions. I was very impressed. Australia's parliament is divided into two chambers, the House of Representatives and the Senate. Interesting, in a very low-grade sort of way, that they use the British term for the institution and the American terms for the chambers. And both of these were open for inspection from the visitors' galleries. Both were quite small, but handsomer than I had expected. On television, the green of the House of Representatives has a decidedly bilious look, as if the members are debating inside someone's pancreas, but in person it was much more tasteful and restrained. The Senate, which I had never seen on television, I believe because the senators don't actually do anything, though I will check my John Gunther and get back to you on this, was in a rest augur tone. In a large upstairs foyer was a gallery containing portraits in oil of all the prime ministers, which I toured with interest. I had been doing quite a lot of reading, as you can imagine, so there was a real pleasure, a genuine "oh, I have heard so much about your quality," in seeing their faces at last. Here was kindly old Ben Chifley, a Labour PM just after the war, and so much a man of the people that when in Canberra he stayed in the modest Carrigan Hotel at a cost to the taxpayer of just 6 shillings a day, and could be found each morning strolling in his dressing gown to the communal bathroom to shave and wash with the other guests. Then there was the Grant and Leonine Robert Menzies, who was Prime Minister for 20 years but thought of himself as British to the bootstraps and dreamed of retiring to a cottage in the English countryside, evidently happy to turn his back on his native soil forever. And poor old Harold Holt, whose faithful plunge into the sea in 1967 earned him my permanent devotion. It's quite a small club. Since 1901, Australia has just 24 prime ministers, and was startled to realize how many of them remained unfamiliar to me. Of the 24, I counted 14 of whom I knew essentially nothing, including 8, exactly 1/3, of whom I had not even heard. This included the festively named Sir Errol Christmas Grafton Page, who was, to be fair, Prime Minister for less than a month in 1939, but also William McMahon, who held the office for almost 2 years in the early 1970s, and whose existence was until this moment quite unsuspected by me. I would have felt worse about this except that only the day before I had read an article in the papers reporting a government study that had found Australians themselves were essentially as ignorant of these men as I was, that indeed more people in Australia could identify and discuss the achievements of George Washington than could provide similar service for their own first elected head of state, Sir Edmund Barton. And with that sobering thought to ponder, I left the nation's capital and set off for distant Adelaide.